At my son's lavish outdoor wedding, his bride pushed my wife into the freezing mud in front of 200 guests. As my wife lay bleeding on the ground, my son wrapped his arm around his new bride and whispered something that made her laugh out loud. I didn't scream or cause a scene. I simply walked up to the band, grabbed the microphone, and delivered a message that made the bride's wealthy father drop his champagne glass. Before we get into the details of exactly what I said, let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. If you believe toxic people should face the consequences of their actions, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I am Russell, 65 years old, and until that rainy Saturday afternoon, I genuinely believed I had raised a respectful son. Cameron was 28, standing at the altar of a sprawling country club estate I had rented for the weekend. The morning rain had left the manicured outdoor reception grounds completely slick. Puddles of thick mud bordered the pristine white silk runner stretching down the central aisle. The entire setup had cost me $120,000, a massive check I wrote simply because my wife Diane begged me to give our only child the perfect day. My wife Diane was 63. She had spent the entire morning trying to keep the fragile peace. Vanessa, a 26-year-old woman who treated service workers like stray dogs, had already driven her professional bridal stylist to tears. The stylist quit 2 hours before the ceremony, storming out of the bridal suite after Vanessa threw a silver hairbrush at her head. Diane, always the patient peacemaker, stepped in to help pin the intricate veil, swallowing the verbal abuse Vanessa hurled at her just to ensure Cameron's ceremony started on time. The vows were finally exchanged under a floral archway. The 200 invited guests cheered. The expensive string quartet transitioned into an upbeat tempo as the newlyweds began their walk back down the aisle. I stood near the front row next to Montgomery, Vanessa's father. Montgomery was a loud, arrogant man already swirling a glass of top-shelf scotch from the open bar I had fully funded. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind caught Vanessa's heavy designer veil. The delicate imported lace snagged violently on the jagged edge of a decorative wooden rose trellis. Diane immediately rushed forward from her seat. She only wanted to unhook the fabric before it tore and ruined the photographs. She smiled warmly, reaching out to gently lift the delicate material away from the splinters. Vanessa did not hesitate. She turned around, her face twisted in pure disgust, and shoved Diane squarely in the chest with both hands. The sheer force of the sudden push sent my wife stumbling backward. Her heels lost traction on the wet grass. Diane fell hard, twisting awkwardly, before slamming down into a deep, freezing puddle of thick brown mud. The sound of her body hitting the ground echoed loudly over the classical music. Mud splashed violently across Diane's expensive silk dress, ruining the custom fabric instantly. Worse, the impact caused her face to scrape against the sharp edge of a stone pathway marker. A bright trickle of blood immediately welled up along her cheekbone. She sat there in the dirt, completely stunned, looking up at the young woman she had just tried to help. My protective instincts flared instantly. I stepped forward, my eyes locked on Vanessa, ready to demand an immediate explanation. But I never reached her. Cameron stepped directly into my path. My own son pressed his palm firmly against my chest, physically blocking me from checking on his mother. I looked at his face, expecting to see shock, embarrassment, or at least a hurried apology. Instead, his expression was completely blank. He turned his back to me, wrapping his arm protectively around Vanessa's waist. He leaned down and whispered something directly into her ear. Vanessa threw her head back and laughed, a loud, mocking, cruel sound that cut through the murmurs of the confused crowd. Neither of them even glanced down at Diane. They just kept laughing, entirely amused by the sight of my wife bleeding in the dirt. A cold, profound clarity washed over me in that exact second. Any hot anger I felt evaporated, replaced instantly by absolute calculating precision. For 3 years, I had ignored the glaring warning signs. The massive credit card bills I quietly paid off to keep Cameron out of debt. The luxury downtown penthouse lease I guaranteed under my corporate holding company, because Cameron's tech startup was failing to generate a single dollar of profit. The blatant, sneering disrespect Vanessa showed toward my wife at every Sunday dinner. I had tolerated it all to keep the family intact. That illusion of family died the moment Cameron laughed. I did not shout. I did not shove my son out of the way. I simply knelt down into the mud and helped Diane to her feet. I pulled my clean linen handkerchief from my suit pocket and gently pressed it against her bleeding cheek. I handed her the keys to my car and told her in a quiet voice to go start the engine and wait for me. Once she was safely walking away from the crowd, I turned my attention toward the main stage. The wedding band was preparing to announce the formal reception dinner. I walked calmly past the whispering guests, ignoring their staring eyes. I stepped onto the wooden platform, reached past the bewildered lead singer, and firmly unplugged his guitar from the main amplifier. A sharp buzz of feedback echoed across the expansive lawn. I pulled the microphone off the heavy iron stand. The 200 guests fell dead silent. You could hear the wind rustling through the damp trees. I looked out over the crowd, locating Cameron and Vanessa standing near the head table, still wearing those arrogant smirks. I shifted my gaze toward Montgomery, who had just raised his crystal champagne flute to his lips to initiate a celebratory toast to his daughter's new wealthy lifestyle. I kept my voice perfectly level. The microphone projected my words clearly across the entire estate, echoing off the clubhouse walls. I announced that effective immediately, the premium open bar was permanently closed. I looked directly at the head catering manager, who was standing by the kitchen doors with a dozen waiters holding trays of expensive appetizers. I informed him publicly that all catering services were officially canceled, and I would absolutely not be authorizing the final $80,000 payment for the reception dinner. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Waiters immediately froze in their tracks, but I didn't stop there. Looking directly into Cameron's shocked eyes, I declared that all financial funding for the newlyweds' future was permanently revoked. I stated clearly into the microphone that the black corporate credit card currently sitting inside his tuxedo jacket was no longer active. I announced that the penthouse lease would be terminated, and they had exactly until the end of the weekend to figure out how to pay for their own lives, because the bank of his parents had permanently shut its heavy vault doors. Montgomery lowered his champagne flute, his face rapidly draining of color. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the stone patio. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew his spoiled daughter had just married a man whose entire luxurious lifestyle was artificially propped up by my silent, ongoing financial contributions. Vanessa's smug smile completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, panicked confusion. She grabbed Cameron's arm, shaking him. Cameron opened his mouth to speak, but the sheer magnitude of the public humiliation rendered him entirely mute. I didn't wait for a pathetic excuse or a fake apology. I dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a heavy, deafening thud that signaled the absolute end of my tolerance. I turned my back on the lavish party I had spent a fortune to create. The band did not resume playing. The bartenders immediately began packing up the expensive liquor bottles, refusing to serve another drop. Guests stared awkwardly at the ground, grabbing their coats, realizing the luxurious free ride was officially over. I walked calmly toward the parking lot, pulling my cell phone from my jacket pocket, ready to initiate the next phase of the most severe adjustment my son would ever experience. I dropped the microphone onto the wooden stage. It landed with a heavy thud that echoed across the manicured lawn. The high-pitched whine of audio feedback faded away, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Then the frantic whispers began. 200 guests, people who had just been drinking my top-shelf liquor and eating the expensive food I paid for, suddenly parted like the Red Sea. They stepped back onto the wet grass to clear a path as I walked away from the stage. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead. I reached Diane. She was standing near the edge of the stone patio, shivering slightly in her ruined silk dress. The thick brown mud had already started to dry and crack against the expensive pale fabric. The cut on her cheek had stopped bleeding, but a dark purple bruise was already forming around her eye. I gently took her arm. She leaned her weight into me, her silence speaking much louder than any complaint she could have made. We walked toward the valet stand together. No one tried to stop us. Montgomery stood completely frozen by the shattered remains of his crystal champagne glass. The catering staff was already tossing the miniature crab cakes and expensive appetizers into heavy black trash bags. The luxurious party was officially over. We reached my dark blue sedan parked under the large oak trees. I opened the passenger door for Diane and helped her inside, making sure she was warm and comfortable. Before I could walk around to the driver's side, I heard heavy, angry footsteps squishing through the wet grass right behind me. It was Cameron. His expensive custom tuxedo was completely spotless, a stark and sickening contrast to his mother, sitting bruised and covered in mud inside my car. His face was flushed red with absolute rage. He did not ask how Diane was doing. He did not look at the blood drying on her face. Instead, he slammed his open hand against the roof of my car and demanded to know what on earth was wrong with me. He screamed that I had just humiliated Vanessa in front of her entire wealthy family. He actually demanded that I march right back to that stage, apologize publicly to his new wife, and instruct the bartenders to immediately reopen the open bar. I looked at my son. I looked at the boy I had coached in baseball, the boy whose expensive college tuition I had paid in full, the man whose entirely fake luxury lifestyle I was currently funding. He honestly believed I was going to back down. He believed his loud tantrum would work, because it had always worked when he was younger. I did not say a single word to him. I simply opened my door, sat down in the driver's seat, and turned the ignition. Cameron grabbed the window frame with both hands, leaning his face inside the cabin. He threatened that if I drove away right now, I would never see him again. I looked him dead in the eye, pressed the window button, and rolled the heavy glass straight up. He had to jump back quickly to avoid getting his fingers crushed. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the country club parking lot, leaving him standing completely alone in the rain. The drive down the winding canyon road was completely quiet. Diane rested her head against the cool leather seat and closed her eyes. She did not cry. My wife is a remarkably strong woman, and I knew she was silently processing the final death of the boy she had raised. I steered the car with my left hand and reached for my phone with my right. I navigated to my contacts and pressed the name Sinclair. Sinclair was not just a simple family lawyer. He was the senior corporate litigator for my holding company. He was a ruthless man who dealt exclusively in ironclad contracts, asset protection, and zero-tolerance policies. He answered the phone on the second ring. He already knew about the wedding, of course. He had strongly advised me against paying for it months ago, warning me about Vanessa's toxic nature. I did not bother with any polite pleasantries. I told him to execute Directive Zero immediately. There was a brief pause on the line. Directive Zero was a severe legal contingency protocol we had drafted 2 years ago, back when Cameron first demanded I co-sign the lease on his luxury apartment. Sinclair had insisted we build a legal kill switch into every single financial agreement tied to my son, just in case Cameron ever crossed a line we could not forgive. Today, that line was crossed, stomped on, and buried deep in the freezing mud. Sinclair asked for my formal verbal confirmation. I gave it to him without a second of hesitation. I instructed him to immediately contact the corporate division of American Express. Cameron was currently carrying a solid black corporate credit card linked directly to my primary business account. He planned to use that exact card this afternoon to pay for their first-class flights to Bora Bora, their exclusive overwater bungalow, and their private island boat excursions. I told Sinclair to freeze the account entirely. I told him not to lower the limit and not to flag it for fraud review. I wanted it frozen completely solid, effective this very second. Next, I moved on to the housing situation. Cameron and Vanessa lived in a massive downtown penthouse that cost $5,000 a month. Cameron's failing technology startup could not even generate enough revenue to cover the electric bills. I was the silent financial guarantor on that residential lease. I instructed Sinclair to legally withdraw my guarantor status immediately. By removing my financial backing, Cameron would instantly violate the strict income requirements of the luxury building. The property management company would have absolutely no choice but to initiate an immediate eviction protocol. I could hear Sinclair typing rapidly on his mechanical keyboard. He stopped and warned me that canceling the credit cards and pulling the lease guarantee simultaneously would create a massive financial whiplash. He reminded me that Cameron and Vanessa were scheduled to leave for their international honeymoon in exactly 4 hours. If I froze the corporate accounts right now, the reality of their sudden bankruptcy would hit them before they even reached the airport security checkpoint. They would be stranded at the terminal, deeply in debt and legally homeless by Monday morning. I gripped the leather steering wheel tighter. I told my lawyer that was exactly the point of this exercise. For his entire adult life, Cameron had operated under the arrogant assumption that my wealth was his permanent safety net. He genuinely believed he could treat his mother like garbage, disrespect our family name, and still sleep on Egyptian cotton sheets paid for by my hard work. I was not just cutting off his money. I was completely dismantling his false reality. I was forcing him to finally face the brutal, unfiltered consequences of his own actions. Sinclair confirmed the orders. He told me the American Express card was officially dead, and the lease withdrawal notice was already being faxed directly to the penthouse property manager. He promised to call me if anything escalated legally. I thanked him and ended the call. As soon as I hung up with my attorney, the digital screen on my dashboard lit up brightly. It was an incoming call from Cameron. He must have walked back to the reception area and realized the caterers had actually packed up all the expensive food and driven away. The screen flashed his name in bright letters. I let it ring. A moment later, a loud notification pinged, then another, then 5 more in rapid succession. Text messages were flooding in. He was demanding I answer the phone. He was demanding I fix the catering situation immediately. He was demanding I transfer funds to his personal checking account because the valet driver was refusing to release his leased sports car without a cash payment. He was completely panicking. The grand illusion of his power and wealth was evaporating by the minute. I did not read the text messages. I did not listen to the frantic voicemails he started leaving. I picked up my phone from the center console, opened the glove compartment, tossed the device inside, and snapped the small door shut. The ringing became muffled, distant, and entirely irrelevant. I looked over at Diane. She opened her eyes, reached across the center console, and placed her warm hand gently over mine. We drove the rest of the way home in absolute peaceful silence, leaving the desperate noise of our son's ruined ego far behind us. 4 hours after I drove away from the country club, my son walked through the sliding glass doors of the international terminal. He was pushing a brass luggage cart stacked high with expensive designer suitcases. Vanessa walked right beside him, still wearing her reception dress, having changed out of her muddy wedding gown. She held a massive iced coffee and wore large, dark sunglasses indoors. They bypassed the massive line of tired travelers waiting in the economy section. They headed straight for the red carpet at the first-class check-in desk. Cameron stepped up to the counter with absolute confidence. He handed the ticketing agent their passports and pulled out the solid black corporate credit card I had given him. He told the agent they were heading to Bora Bora for a 3-week honeymoon. He expected to be handed a glass of champagne and 2 premium boarding passes. The airline agent smiled politely and typed their confirmation numbers into her computer. She took the heavy black metal card and swiped it through the terminal. The machine beeped once. A bright red message flashed across the digital screen. The agent frowned slightly and pressed a few buttons. She swiped the card a second time. Another sharp beep. The red light flashed again. She handed the card back to Cameron, apologizing profusely. She told him the card was completely declined by the issuer, and she needed another form of payment to cover the international departure taxes and final baggage fees. Cameron let out a loud, exasperated sigh. He looked at Vanessa and rolled his eyes, acting like this was just a minor inconvenience caused by a stupid bank algorithm. He confidently told the agent that his father must have forgotten to notify American Express about their international travel plans. He reached into his leather wallet and pulled out his personal bank debit card. This was the joint checking account he shared with Vanessa. It was the account where he deposited his small executive salary from his failing tech startup. He handed the blue plastic card to the agent, expecting a quick approval. The agent ran the card. The machine beeped a third time. She looked up at Cameron, her customer service smile completely gone. She informed him that his personal account had insufficient funds. Cameron completely froze. He snatched the card back and pulled out his smartphone. He quickly logged into his mobile banking application. He expected to see at least $10,000 sitting in his available balance. Instead, he stared at a negative number written in bright red text. His account was overdrawn by almost $12,000. Panic set in. He scrolled rapidly through the recent transaction history. He saw charge after charge that he did not recognize. $5,000 to an exotic floral importer. $3,000 for an imported ice sculpture. $4,000 for a custom-designed post-reception lounge area. These were all secret last-minute wedding upgrades Vanessa had purchased behind his back just days before the ceremony. She had completely drained their personal savings knowing he would never notice until it was too late. She had assumed my corporate card would seamlessly cover their lavish honeymoon and everyday living expenses going forward, so she felt completely entitled to burn through their own cash. Cameron slowly turned his phone around and showed the negative balance to his new wife. He demanded to know what she had done. Vanessa did not apologize. She did not express a single ounce of guilt for bankrupting them. Instead, she looked at the declined cards and the airline agent and completely lost her temper. She realized the luxurious vacation she had been bragging about to her friends was not going to happen. She slammed her hands down hard on the ticketing counter. She started screaming at the agent, demanding they issue the boarding passes immediately. She yelled that her father was an important man and she would have the agent fired for disrespecting her. Her voice echoed loudly through the quiet first-class terminal. Other wealthy passengers stopped checking their bags and turned to watch the spectacle. Several people pulled out their phones and started recording the meltdown. Cameron tried to grab her arm to pull her away, but she shoved him off, completely unhinged by the sudden loss of her expected luxury. The screaming attracted the attention of airport security. 2 large armed officers approached the ticketing counter rapidly. They did not care about Vanessa's expensive clothes or her loud threats. They calmly but firmly instructed her to step away from the desk. When she refused and cursed at them, one officer placed his hand on his radio and warned her she was seconds away from being arrested for disturbing the peace. That finally shut her up. The officers ordered Cameron and Vanessa to gather their designer luggage and leave the secure area immediately. They were given a humiliating public escort right through the middle of the crowded terminal. Hundreds of ordinary travelers watched as the wealthy, entitled couple was marched out the sliding glass doors like common criminals. They stood on the wet concrete curb outside the departure level. The rain had started falling again. Cameron opened his ride-sharing application to call a premium luxury vehicle to take them home. The app immediately flashed an error message because it was linked to the dead corporate credit card. He tried to link his personal debit card, but the system rejected it for insufficient funds. They were entirely stranded. They had thousands of dollars worth of clothes in their suitcases, but not a single dollar to pay a taxi driver. Cameron looked at his wife, who was crying angrily, ruining her expensive makeup. He realized he only had one option left. He had to swallow his remaining pride and call her father. Montgomery answered the phone, sounding completely exhausted. He had just returned home from the disastrous wedding reception. Cameron awkwardly explained they were stuck at the airport and desperately needed a ride back to the city. 30 minutes later, Montgomery pulled up to the curb in his large black luxury SUV. He did not get out to help them with their heavy bags. Cameron had to hoist the massive suitcases into the trunk himself, soaking his expensive shoes in the airport puddles. He climbed into the back seat next to a pouting Vanessa. The interior of the vehicle was completely silent. Montgomery did not ask about their honeymoon. He did not offer any words of comfort. He put the vehicle in drive and merged onto the highway, heading back toward the downtown skyline. 10 minutes into the drive, Montgomery finally spoke. He looked at Cameron through the rearview mirror. His eyes were cold and calculating. He bluntly demanded to know exactly why my money had suddenly vanished. He wanted to know what Cameron had done to provoke such a severe and public financial execution. Cameron tried to stammer out an excuse. He tried to blame me, claiming I was just being a controlling tyrant who overreacted to a simple accident in the mud. Montgomery did not buy a single word of it. He was a ruthless businessman who built his own empire from nothing. He knew men like me do not shut off the financial valves without concrete, irrefutable reasons. He gripped the steering wheel and told Cameron that he was going to hire his own private accountants to look into everything starting tomorrow morning. He warned his new son-in-law that if he found out Cameron was hiding any massive debts or legal troubles, the marriage would be annulled before the ink on the certificate even dried. Cameron sank back into the leather seat, completely trapped by the walls closing in around him. The heavy rain was still coming down in sheets when Montgomery pulled his large luxury vehicle up to the curb. He stopped right outside the towering glass facade of the downtown high-rise. He did not put the car in park, and he did not say a single word of goodbye. He just unlocked the doors from the driver's seat and waited for them to get out. Cameron and Vanessa dragged their soaked designer luggage onto the wet concrete sidewalk. The massive black vehicle immediately sped away, leaving them standing completely alone under the small canvas awning. This building was this absolute crown jewel of the downtown real estate market. It featured armed private security, a heated rooftop pool, and 24-hour valet parking. Cameron had been living on the top floor for 2 years, acting like he owned the entire city skyline. They pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the warm marble lobby. Vanessa was complaining loudly about her wet shoes and her ruined hair. She told Cameron to order expensive takeout food the second they got upstairs because she was starving and stressed. They walked right past the front desk without acknowledging the concierge. They headed straight for the private elevator bank reserved exclusively for the penthouse suites. Cameron reached into his wet jacket pocket and pulled out his black electronic key fob. He pressed the small plastic disc against the illuminated security scanner mounted on the marble wall. Usually the scanner chimed a pleasant green tone and the heavy brass elevator doors slid open instantly. This time the scanner emitted a harsh buzzing sound. A bright red light flashed across the digital screen. The word "denied" appeared in bold block letters. Cameron frowned and wiped the fob on his sleeve. He assumed the rainwater was simply interfering with the signal. He pressed it against the scanner a second time. The harsh buzz echoed through the quiet lobby again. The red light flashed twice. Access denied. Vanessa let out an exaggerated groan and told him to stop playing around. She was tired and wanted a hot shower right now. Cameron angrily pressed the call button for the lobby concierge to complain about the broken scanner. Before the concierge could even answer, a voice called out from across the wide room. I told him the scanner was working exactly the way it was supposed to work. Cameron spun around, completely startled. I was sitting comfortably in a high-backed leather armchair near the grand fireplace. I had a cup of hot black coffee resting on the small glass table next to me. Sinclair stood right beside my chair holding his thick leather briefcase. We had been waiting for them to arrive for almost an hour. The absolute shock on Cameron's face was pathetic to witness. He looked at me and then looked at the red light on the scanner. His brain was desperately trying to connect the dots of his collapsing world. He dropped the handle of his heavy suitcase and marched over to where I was sitting. He demanded to know what I was doing in his building. He demanded I tell the concierge to fix the elevator immediately because he and his wife were exhausted from being humiliated at the airport. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I placed the cup down carefully on the glass table. I stood up and buttoned my suit jacket. I looked him right in the eye and told him that he did not own a building. I reminded him that the $5,000 a month lease for the penthouse was held entirely under the name of my primary corporate holding company. I explained that living in that luxury suite was a highly specific corporate housing perk. That perk was strictly reserved for active executive employees of my organization. Cameron stared at me with his mouth hanging open. He reminded me that he was the chief executive officer of his own independent technology startup. He said his company was entirely separate from my business. He told me I had absolutely no right to interfere with his private housing. I shook my head slowly. I told him he really should have read the foundational corporate documents I made him sign 3 years ago when I gave him his initial seed money. I explained that his startup was legally structured as a wholly owned subsidiary of my holding company. I owned the intellectual property. I owned the expensive hardware. I owned his employment contract. And because his startup had failed to meet a single revenue milestone in 3 years, I was officially dissolving his executive position. He was no longer an employee of my company. Therefore, he was no longer entitled to the luxury housing perk. Vanessa suddenly pushed past Cameron. Her face was twisted with pure, furious entitlement. She screamed at me right there in the quiet lobby. She yelled that the penthouse was a wedding gift. She claimed I had given them that apartment as a permanent home to start their new family. She told me I could not legally take back a gift just because I was angry about a little mud on my wife's dress. Sinclair stepped forward. He did not raise his voice or show any emotion. He simply clicked open his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He handed the top paper directly to Vanessa. He told her to read the tenant name listed clearly at the top of the lease agreement. She snatched the paper from his hand. Her eyes scanned the text rapidly. The document clearly listed my corporate entity as the sole legal tenant. Neither her name nor Cameron's name appeared anywhere on the contract. Sinclair explained that in the eyes of the law, they were nothing more than temporary corporate guests. He informed them that the holding company had officially withdrawn its guest authorization effective immediately. The property management had already been notified, and the electronic locks on the penthouse doors had been permanently changed an hour ago. Vanessa dropped the paper onto the marble floor. She looked around the lobby as if expecting someone to jump out and tell her this was just a terrible joke. She realized she was not going to be living in a luxury penthouse. She realized she had married a man who actually owned absolutely nothing. The lavish, elite lifestyle she had manipulated her way into was entirely a mirage built on my money. Cameron finally found his voice. He begged me to stop this right now. He pleaded with me not to do this tonight in the freezing rain. He said they had nowhere else to go and no money to rent a cheap hotel room. He promised he would pay me back for the wedding expenses over time. He promised he would make Vanessa apologize to his mother tomorrow morning. He was willing to say absolutely anything to get back into that warm elevator. I looked at my son and felt absolutely nothing inside. The time for apologies and promises had expired the exact moment he laughed at his bleeding mother. I turned to the 2 large security guards who had quietly approached us during the screaming match. Sinclair had already briefed them on the exact legal situation. I looked back at Cameron and gave him my final, uncompromising terms. I told him he had exactly 5 minutes. I instructed the security guards to escort them up the freight elevator to the penthouse. They were allowed to retrieve their passports, their personal clothing, and whatever small wedding gifts they could carry in their own hands. They were not allowed to take any furniture, any electronics, or any expensive artwork because all of those items belonged to my corporation. I told them that once the 5 minutes were up, they would be escorted out the back service doors into the alley. If they ever stepped foot inside the lobby again, they would be immediately arrested for criminal trespassing. Vanessa started to cry loudly, but it was not out of sadness or regret. It was pure angry frustration at losing her prize. Cameron looked at me one last time, hoping to find some trace of the soft father he used to easily manipulate. He found nothing but cold, hard reality staring back at him. The security guards grabbed their wet suitcases and pointed firmly toward the service hallway. My son and his new bride walked away with their heads down, completely stripped of their false royalty. Sinclair closed his briefcase and we walked out the front doors together, leaving them to their frantic 5-minute scramble. The desperate morning arrived with cold, gray skies. Cameron woke up shivering in the cramped driver's seat of his leased luxury sports car. After being thrown out of the penthouse, they had nowhere else to go. They had parked in a dark municipal garage overnight. His expensive custom wedding tuxedo was terribly wrinkled and smelled like damp wool. Vanessa was asleep in the passenger seat, wrapped in a thin jacket. Her designer makeup was smudged down her cheeks. Cameron checked his phone, hoping to see a message from me apologizing for the harsh night. His screen was completely blank. Panic began to claw at his chest. He desperately needed cash to secure a hotel room and buy food. He remembered the corporate operating accounts for his technology startup. The business account held a healthy reserve fund meant for paying the developers. He started the engine and drove out of the concrete garage, heading straight toward the commercial business district. He convinced himself he could simply authorize a massive emergency executive bonus to hold them over until I finally calmed down. He still honestly believed this was just a temporary punishment. He parked the sports car illegally near the front entrance of his office building. He left Vanessa sleeping with the engine running and walked into the sleek, modern lobby. He tried to smooth his wrinkled jacket, attempting to project his usual arrogant confidence to the building staff. He approached the automated glass security turnstiles and pulled his white plastic keycard from his wallet. He slapped the card against the digital reader and pushed his weight against the heavy glass barrier, expecting it to slide open smoothly. The glass did not move. A harsh buzzing sound echoed through the quiet lobby. The small digital display mounted on the turnstile flashed a bright red light. Access denied. A building security guard walked over with a serious expression. Cameron immediately demanded the guard manually override the system. He spoke with the loud, entitled tone he always used when addressing service workers. The guard calmly looked at his digital tablet and informed Cameron that his access privileges had been permanently revoked by the primary leaseholder an hour ago. Cameron laughed a loud and incredibly nervous sound. He told the security guard that he was the chief executive officer of the technology company on the 12th floor, and he demanded to be led upstairs immediately. The guard did not argue, but he firmly refused to open the security gate. Cameron spotted a young intern scanning his badge nearby. Before the glass doors could close, Cameron forcefully pushed his way through the narrow gap right behind the intern. He ignored the security guard shouting behind him and sprinted into an open elevator, pressing the button for the 12th floor. The elevator doors slid open to his startup. He expected to hear the usual sounds of his employees playing table tennis and listening to loud music. Instead, the massive open-concept office floor was completely silent. 50 highly paid software developers were sitting quietly at their desks, staring intensely at their computer monitors. No one looked up to greet him. The chief technology officer turned his head away quickly when Cameron walked past his cubicle. Cameron felt a freezing cold knot form deep in his stomach. He marched straight down the long hallway toward his massive glass corner office. He needed to access his desktop computer to initiate the wire transfer immediately. He grabbed the heavy metal handle of his private office door, but it refused to turn. The door was locked from the outside. He pressed his face against the clear glass and looked inside. His expensive modern desk was completely empty. His framed college diplomas had been taken down from the walls. His personalized coffee mug and his favorite desk accessories were sitting aside a small brown cardboard box, resting on the carpet. He turned around, furiously ready to shout at his employees and demand answers. Then he noticed the frosted glass doors of the main executive boardroom at the far end of the hallway. The bright overhead fluorescent lights were turned on, and shadows were moving slowly inside the room. He stormed down the hallway and pushed open the heavy wooden boardroom doors. I was sitting comfortably at the absolute head of the massive oak conference table. I was relaxing in the incredibly expensive Italian leather chair he had specifically imported for himself using company funds. Sinclair was sitting to my right, silently arranging a neat stack of detailed financial ledgers. I looked up at my son. His hair was messy, and his face was pale with pure exhaustion. He looked entirely pathetic, standing there in his ruined wedding clothes. I gestured calmly toward the empty chair at the opposite end of the long, polished table. Cameron did not sit down. He slammed his hands hard onto the wooden table and demanded to know how I had bypassed the building security. He yelled that he was going to call the police and have me arrested for breaking and entering into his private corporate headquarters. I leaned back in his comfortable chair and folded my hands, resting them on my lap. I told him he was more than welcome to dial emergency services right now, but the police would be very interested to see the true legal ownership documents of this specific business. I nodded at Sinclair. My attorney slid a thick black binder down the length of the table until it stopped directly in front of Cameron. Cameron opened the heavy binder with visibly shaking hands. I decided it was finally time to explain the harsh reality of his business to him. I reminded him about the conversation we had 3 years ago when he came to my house begging for $2 million in seed capital. He had a decent software concept, but absolutely zero practical business sense. I gave him the money to start his company, but I did not just hand him a blank check. I knew his long history of profound financial incompetence. I knew he lacked basic discipline. So I had Sinclair legally structure his entire startup as a wholly owned subsidiary of my primary investment firm. I gave him the fancy chief executive title and the massive corner office strictly to stroke his fragile ego. But on legal paper, my parent firm owned 90% of the equity and held absolute voting control over the entire board of directors. I continued explaining the details slowly and clearly so his panicked brain could fully process the crushing information. I told him to look at the third page of the employment contract inside the binder. His employment agreement contained highly specific quarterly revenue milestones. If he hit those financial targets, he got to keep his job and earn his massive executive bonuses. But if he missed those exact targets for 3 consecutive quarters, the parent company had the absolute legal right to step in. My firm had the right to absorb the subsidiary, liquidate its assets, and terminate the entire executive team for cause without any warning. Cameron stared blindly at the signature page. It was his own sloppy signature. He had signed that document 3 years ago without ever bothering to read the fine print, because he arrogantly assumed his wealthy father would never actually enforce the rules against his own blood. Cameron weakly tried to argue that the commercial software market was just currently slow. He claimed his development team was right on the verge of a major profitable breakthrough, and he just needed 6 more months to show a return on my investment. I stopped his pathetic lies right there. I told Sinclair to project the company bank statements onto the large white screen mounted on the wall behind me. Rows of bright yellow highlighted expenses appeared for the entire room to see. I read them out loud one by one. First-class flights to Paris labeled as networking events, when he actually took Vanessa on a highly romantic vacation. Diamond tennis bracelets written off as client retention gifts. $10,000 of company money withdrawn to pay the lease on his luxury sports car downstairs. I told him he had not missed his revenue targets because the market was slow. He had missed them because he was deliberately using the company operating accounts as his own personal piggy bank to fund Vanessa's lavish lifestyle. The silence in the large boardroom was incredibly heavy. Cameron stared at the projected bank statements, knowing he was completely caught. He had committed severe and undeniable fiduciary misconduct. I stood up from the leather chair and straightened my suit tie. I looked at the boy I had tried so hard to protect from his own destructive nature. I told him that as the majority shareholder, I was officially exercising my legal right to absorb the company. The startup was now operating under my direct management. Furthermore, because of his blatant financial embezzlement, he was officially terminated for cause effective immediately. There would be absolutely no generous severance package. There would be no golden parachute and no recommendation letters. He was officially entirely unemployed and legally broke. Cameron started crying right there in the middle of the boardroom. He broke down completely and begged me to just let him wire $5,000 to his personal checking account so he could get a cheap hotel room and figure things out. He promised he would pay it all back with interest. I walked slowly around the large oak table and stood directly in front of him. I reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the electronic keys to his leased sports car. I calmly reminded him that the vehicle was officially a company asset, and I was repossessing it right now. I pointed toward the glass doors and told him his cardboard box was waiting in the hallway. I ordered him to pick up his trash and get out of my building forever. The drive to Montgomery's sprawling country estate took less than an hour, but to Cameron, it felt like an agonizing death march. He had no car and no credit cards. They had scraped together some loose change from the bottom of Vanessa's designer purse simply to buy 2 public transit bus tickets to the wealthy suburbs. They rode the dirty city bus all the way to the end of the line. Cameron held his small cardboard box on his lap, while Vanessa stared out the window in absolute disgust. They walked the final 2 miles up a steep winding road to reach the massive iron gates of Montgomery's private estate. The security cameras tracked their every move as Cameron pressed the intercom button, begging the guards to let them inside. The heavy gates finally swung open. They dragged their exhausted bodies up the long gravel driveway. Vanessa immediately began complaining about her sore feet and demanding a hot meal. She fully expected her wealthy father to welcome her with open arms and instantly write a massive check to fix all her problems. She genuinely believed the nightmare was finally over. Montgomery was waiting for them inside his massive mahogany study. He did not offer them warm food. He did not offer them comfort. He sat behind his large, polished desk, staring at the 2 of them with cold, predatory eyes. Cameron placed his cardboard box on the floor and awkwardly asked for a temporary loan of $1 million. He promised to start a brand new technology company and pay Montgomery back with massive interest. He claimed that I had illegally stolen his subsidiary out of pure spite, and that my actions would never hold up in a court of law. He painted himself as the completely innocent victim of a tyrannical father. Montgomery let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the wood surface. He bluntly informed Cameron that he did not become a multimillionaire by writing blank checks to unemployed men who cried about their fathers. Montgomery was a ruthless corporate predator who only cared about return on investment and brutal retaliation. He was absolutely furious about the public humiliation his family suffered at the wedding reception, but he was not going to throw his own money into a sinking ship. He wanted blood. He wanted to file a massive corporate lawsuit against me to force a highly lucrative financial settlement. But to do that, he needed concrete, irrefutable proof that I had acted maliciously and illegally when I seized the technology startup. Montgomery pressed a button on his desk phone and summoned his senior private accountant into the study. The accountant was a quiet, meticulous man who had managed the finances of Montgomery's global logistics empire for over 20 years. Montgomery ordered the accountant to conduct a deep forensic audit of Cameron's startup. He wanted every single financial ledger thoroughly examined. Cameron eagerly opened his personal laptop, which he had saved in his cardboard box. He handed the machine over to the accountant, granting him full access to the cloud-based accounting software used by the startup. Cameron felt a sudden surge of false hope. He honestly believed his sloppy financial records would only show minor careless mistakes. He never imagined the absolute horror that was hiding deep inside those digital numbers. The accountant took the laptop into the adjoining library and closed the heavy oak doors. He warned them the forensic process would take several hours. Vanessa immediately lost interest in the business talk. She walked over to the corner bar, poured herself a large glass of expensive wine, and lounged comfortably on a leather sofa. She started loudly discussing which luxury hotel they should move into once her father destroyed me in court. Cameron paced nervously back and forth across the Persian rug, biting his fingernails. Montgomery ignored both of them, entirely choosing to read his corporate emails in total silence. The tension in the room grew thicker with every passing hour. 4 hours later, the library doors slowly opened. The senior accountant walked back into the study. His face was completely pale, and his hands were physically shaking as he held a printed stack of financial reports. He did not look at Cameron, and he completely ignored Vanessa. He walked directly to Montgomery, and placed the papers face down on the massive desk. The accountant spoke in a quiet, trembling voice. He told his boss that there was absolutely no legal ground to sue me. He confirmed that my hostile takeover was entirely lawful because the startup was completely bankrupt. But that was not the reason the accountant was shaking. He leaned down and whispered something directly into Montgomery's ear. Montgomery frowned deeply. He picked up the stack of papers and flipped them over. His eyes scanned the top page. The room fell into a terrifying silence. Cameron stopped pacing. Vanessa lowered her wine glass, sensing a sudden dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Montgomery read the second page and then the third. The veins in his neck began to bulge against his collar. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He was not looking at evidence of my wrongdoing. He was staring directly at a meticulously documented trail of massive corporate theft targeting his own empire. Montgomery slammed his heavy fist down on the desk with such explosive force that a crystal water glass shattered onto the floor. He slowly stood up from his chair. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He looked directly at his daughter with a gaze of pure, absolute hatred. Vanessa shrank back into the leather sofa, terrified by the murderous look in her father's eyes. Cameron stepped backward, confused and terrified. He asked Montgomery what the papers said. He desperately hoped the accountant had made a simple mathematical error. Montgomery ignored Cameron completely. He picked up the top paper and read the numbers out loud. He revealed a massive financial discrepancy that had been hiding in plain sight for the last 14 months. Montgomery owned a highly profitable global logistics company. Over the past year, his logistics company had paid out hundreds of thousands of dollars to Cameron's startup for alleged custom software consulting. Cameron had always bragged about landing his father-in-law as a major corporate client, but the senior accountant had just discovered the absolute truth. The startup never actually provided a single line of software code to the logistics firm. The invoices were entirely fake. Vanessa had utilized her privileged access to her father's logistics company to manually authorize those massive vendor payments. She systematically transferred huge sums of her father's corporate money directly into the bank accounts of Cameron's startup. But the money did not stay there. Vanessa had also demanded administrative access to her husband's business accounts, claiming she wanted to help him manage the payroll. Cameron, being completely naive and blindly trusting, had given her all the administrative passwords. Montgomery read the final destination of the stolen funds out loud. The moment the stolen logistics money hit the startup account, Vanessa immediately wired it out to a series of fake third-party vendor invoices. But those vendors did not exist either. They were private shell accounts controlled exclusively by Vanessa. She used that heavily laundered money to secretly fund her incredibly lavish lifestyle behind everyone's back. Montgomery read the specific line items with a voice dripping in absolute disgust. He read the $80,000 charge for her custom-imported wedding dress. He read the $50,000 initiation fee for her elite country club membership. He read the massive charges for luxury spa retreats and diamond jewelry. Vanessa had been systematically embezzling a fortune from her own father to project the illusion of immense personal wealth. She had deliberately used her new husband's failing business as a money laundering front to hide the theft from her father's auditors. The accountant had only uncovered the truth because he finally had access to both sides of the fraudulent transactions at the same time. He matched the fake logistics payments perfectly with the fake startup withdrawals. The financial trail was absolute and undeniable. Cameron felt his knees go weak. The room started to spin. He finally realized why his startup was always running out of operating capital despite the massive investments I kept pouring into it. His own wife had been bleeding his company dry from the inside to steal from her father. She had turned Cameron into an unwitting accomplice to massive federal wire fraud. He looked at Vanessa, who was now crying hysterically on the sofa. She was not crying out of guilt or remorse. She was crying because she had finally been caught. She had completely destroyed the lives of two different families just to wear expensive clothes and sip champagne at the country club. Montgomery slowly picked up his desk phone. He glared at his daughter and told her the free ride was permanently over. Montgomery did not utter a single word into the telephone receiver. He simply slammed it down onto the heavy base with a sharp cracking sound that made Vanessa physically jump on the leather sofa. He picked up the thick stack of audit papers the accountant had left on the desk. He walked slowly across the Persian rug toward his daughter. Vanessa tried to put on a sweet, innocent smile, but it completely failed to mask the sheer terror in her eyes. Montgomery stood towering over her. He raised his arm and threw the entire stack of financial documents directly at her chest. The heavy papers scattered everywhere, completely covering the expensive sofa and spilling onto the floor around her designer shoes. He demanded she explain the vendor invoices. His voice was dangerously low and steady, vibrating with a cold rage that filled the entire room. Vanessa looked down at the highlighted banking numbers. She saw the exact dates and amounts of the money she had stolen from her own father. Her breathing became incredibly shallow. She looked at her father, and then she looked over at Cameron, who was still standing near the door, completely bewildered. In that exact fraction of a second, Vanessa made a highly calculated decision to save herself. She burst into tears. It was not a quiet, subtle cry. It was a loud, dramatic performance, complete with hyperventilating and shaking hands. She curled her knees to her chest and began to sob uncontrollably. Through her fake tears, she pointed a shaking finger directly at her new husband. She told her father that Cameron was a monster. She claimed that Cameron had completely manipulated her from the very beginning of their relationship. She spun a wild, desperate lie, stating that Cameron had forced her to embezzle the money because his technology startup was failing, and he was terrified of looking like a failure to his own wealthy father. Vanessa cried louder, claiming that Cameron had threatened to leave her and ruin her reputation if she did not use her administrative access to route the logistics funds into his corporate accounts. She painted herself as a terrified, abused wife who only committed corporate fraud because she was physically afraid of her husband. Cameron stood frozen in absolute disbelief. His jaw literally dropped open. He listened to the woman he had married less than 48 hours ago completely fabricate a story designed to send him to federal prison. He tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He finally managed to step forward, waving his hands frantically. He looked at Montgomery and swore on his life that he had absolutely no idea where that money came from. He explained that Vanessa had demanded full administrative control over the startup payroll and vendor accounts. He told Montgomery that he was entirely innocent and that his wife was lying to save her own skin. Vanessa abruptly stopped crying just long enough to shout back at him. She demanded to know how he could lie to her father after everything he had forced her to do. She reached down onto the sofa and grabbed one of the printed invoices. She held it up in the air, shaking it toward Cameron. She told her father to look at the bottom of the page. She told him to look at the authorization signature. Montgomery snatched the paper from her hand. He stared at the bottom right corner. Cameron felt a freezing wave of pure dread wash over his entire body. He remembered all those late nights when Vanessa would bring him stacks of printed vendor contracts and payroll authorizations. She would place them on his desk while he was exhausted, complaining that the accounting department was backed up. She would point to the bottom line and tell him to just sign them quickly so the developers could get paid on time. He had signed every single piece of paper she ever put in front of him without ever reading the payee names or the dollar amounts. He had blindly trusted his future wife. His sloppy, careless signature was physically stamped on every single fraudulent invoice she had used to launder the stolen logistics money. Cameron realized with horrifying clarity that Vanessa had been setting him up as the perfect legal fall guy for over a year. If the federal authorities ever audited the accounts, they would see Vanessa initiating the transfers from the logistics firm, but they would see Cameron formally authorizing the receipt and redistribution of those exact funds through his startup. He was legally trapped in a massive wire fraud conspiracy, and his own signature was the primary piece of physical evidence. He looked at Vanessa. The fake tears were still rolling down her cheeks, but her eyes were completely cold and calculating. She was entirely willing to let him take the fall and serve a decade in federal prison just so she could avoid taking responsibility for her own greed. Montgomery looked at the signature and then looked at Cameron. Cameron opened his mouth to explain the late-night document signings, but the words died in his throat. It did not matter what he said. The paperwork was absolute. Montgomery slowly crushed the paper in his large hand. But Montgomery was not a fool. He knew his daughter. He knew her lifelong obsession with status and luxury. He knew she was a master manipulator who never took responsibility for her own actions. He looked back at Vanessa, who was still putting on her crying performance. Montgomery told her to shut her mouth. His voice cracked like a whip echoing off the mahogany walls. Vanessa instantly stopped crying. Montgomery told her he did not care who came up with the idea, and he did not care who forced who. He saw two greedy, entitled parasites standing in his private study. He saw a daughter who had betrayed her own family to buy dresses and a weak son-in-law who was too stupid to manage his own company. He told them they were exactly perfect for each other because they were both completely worthless. Montgomery walked back behind his heavy desk and sat down. He pointed a thick finger toward the heavy wooden doors. He gave them a final, brutal ultimatum. He told them to take their garbage and walk out of his house immediately. He promised them that if they ever called his private phone number again, or if they ever tried to contact any member of his family, he would hand the entire forensic audit over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He stated very clearly that he would happily watch his own daughter go to a maximum security prison if it meant protecting his logistics empire from further contamination. He did not care about family loyalty anymore. He only cared about cutting out the cancer. Vanessa tried to speak again, trying to beg for a small cash allowance to find a safe place to stay. Montgomery slammed his fist on the desk and roared at her to get out before he called the estate security guards to physically drag her down the driveway. The sheer volume of his voice shook the windows. Cameron bent down and picked up his small cardboard box. His hands were shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He turned around and walked out of the study without looking back. Vanessa ran after him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floors. They walked out the front doors of the massive mansion and stepped back into the cold, gloomy afternoon. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind them, echoing with a final, absolute finality. They stood on the gravel driveway, completely alone. The reality of their situation descended upon them like a crushing physical weight. Less than 2 days ago, they were the center of attention at a lavish country club wedding surrounded by 200 wealthy guests. They had unlimited credit cards, a luxury penthouse, and the financial backing of 2 powerful families. Now they had absolutely nothing. Cameron had been permanently disowned by me and stripped of his company. Vanessa had just been permanently disowned by her father and exiled from her family wealth. They were completely isolated from the entire world. They had no money, no shelter, and no allies. They began the long, humiliating walk down the steep gravel driveway in complete silence. The sky above them was turning a dark, bruised purple, signaling another heavy rainstorm was approaching. Cameron felt the cardboard box growing heavy in his arms. It contained the only things he actually owned in the entire world: a coffee mug and some cheap plastic desk toys. He thought about the warm house he grew up in. He thought about the Sunday dinners my wife used to cook for him. He thought about the absolute safety net I had provided for his entire life. He had thrown all of it away for the woman walking silently beside him, a woman who had just demonstrated she would happily destroy his entire life to save herself. Every step they took on the gravel felt like a physical punishment. They reached the massive iron gates at the bottom of the hill. The security cameras tracked them as they walked past the stone pillars and stepped out onto the public road. The heavy gates slowly clicked shut behind them, locking them out of the wealthy world they felt so entitled to. They had to walk 3 miles to reach the nearest bus stop, with only a few coins left in Vanessa's purse. The utter silence between them was not a peaceful quiet. It was the loud, terrifying silence of two people realizing they had completely ruined their own lives. The reality of absolute poverty set in immediately the following morning. Cameron and Vanessa had spent their first night in a dilapidated roadside motel located right next to a busy industrial highway. The room smelled heavily of cheap chemical cleaners and stale cigarette smoke. The mattress was incredibly thin and the stained wallpaper was peeling in the corners. Cameron had completely refused to sleep in the bed with the woman who had just framed him for corporate fraud. He spent the entire night sitting on the hard linoleum floor with his back against the locked door, staring blankly at the flickering neon sign outside the dirty window. Vanessa woke up shivering under a thin, scratchy blanket. She looked around the miserable room and realized she could not survive another day in this environment. She refused to look for a normal job, and she refused to accept her permanent exile from the wealthy world. She decided she needed to create her own leverage to force her way back into our family fortune. Vanessa waited until Cameron finally fell asleep on the floor out of sheer exhaustion. She quietly grabbed his leather wallet and removed the last $20 bill, hidden inside the secret compartment. She left the motel room and walked half a mile down the noisy highway until she found a rundown diner. She used the cash to hire a local delivery driver to take her all the way across the city to our exclusive suburban neighborhood. She knew my daily schedule, and she knew Diane's weekly routine perfectly. Every Tuesday morning, my wife visited a high-end organic grocery market to select fresh produce and imported teas. Vanessa instructed the driver to drop her off near the delivery bays at the back of the market. She planned to catch my wife completely off guard when she was alone and vulnerable. Inside the brightly lit market, Diane was carefully inspecting a display of imported citrus fruits. The harsh purple bruise on her cheek from the wedding day mudfall was slowly fading to a dull yellow, but the physical reminder of the disrespect remained clearly visible. Diane placed a few items into her shopping cart, enjoying the peaceful quiet of the early morning routine. Suddenly, she felt an aggressive presence step directly into her personal space. She turned around and found Vanessa standing inches away from her face. The contrast between the two women was incredibly stark. Diane looked elegant and completely composed in her tailored wool winter coat. Vanessa looked entirely frantic and out of place. Her expensive designer clothes were heavily wrinkled from sleeping in them for 2 days, and her eyes were wild with desperate panic. Vanessa did not bother offering a greeting. She immediately grabbed the front of Diane's shopping cart and shoved it aggressively backward, forcing my wife into a quiet, isolated corner near the massive dairy coolers. There were no other customers or store employees walking down this specific aisle. Vanessa leaned in incredibly close, invading Diane's personal space, and began delivering her highly calculated extortion attempt. She started speaking in a fast, vicious whisper. Vanessa told Diane that she had spent the entire morning drafting a detailed, malicious story that she was preparing to send directly to the most prominent local journalists and television news stations. She claimed she was going to completely destroy my public reputation. She threatened to go on live television and falsely accused me of being a violently abusive tyrant who used my immense corporate wealth to financially enslave and mentally torture my own family. She said she would look directly into the camera and cry, claiming that I had physically assaulted her at the wedding reception because she bravely tried to protect Cameron from my controlling behavior. Vanessa escalated her desperate threats without taking a single breath. She told Diane that she would hire a contingency lawyer to file a massive public civil lawsuit, claiming intentional infliction of severe emotional distress. She openly admitted she knew the lawsuit would be completely baseless and based entirely on lies, but she pointed out that the resulting media circus would cause catastrophic reputational damage to my holding company. She threatened to stage loud public protests directly outside my corporate headquarters and send anonymous emails to my major business investors, claiming my firm was engaged in corrupt, unethical practices. She wanted to make my professional life an absolute living nightmare. Then she laid out her exact demands. Vanessa stated her specific price for keeping her mouth shut. She demanded that Diane go home and force me to immediately reinstate the corporate lease on the luxury downtown penthouse. She demanded the instant reactivation of the black corporate credit card with absolutely no spending limits attached. She demanded a fully funded trust account placed solely in her name to guarantee her future financial security. Finally, she demanded that I publish a formal written apology in the Sunday edition of the local newspaper, admitting I was wrong to cut them off. She pointed a shaking finger at Diane's chest and gave her exactly 24 hours to secure my compliance, or she would press send on the emails to the local news anchors. Vanessa crossed her arms over her chest and waited for Diane to completely crumble. She fully expected my wife to burst into tears, drop her shopping basket, and beg for mercy. Vanessa remembered Diane as the soft, quiet peacemaker who always baked cookies and tried to smooth over every single family conflict. She fundamentally believed Diane was a weak, passive woman who would do absolutely anything to avoid a public scandal. Diane did not cry. She did not take a single step backward. She did not raise her hands defensively. She stood perfectly still and let Vanessa finish every single word of her vicious blackmail demand. She let the silence stretch out for several long, uncomfortable seconds. When she was absolutely certain Vanessa was finished speaking, Diane looked at the younger woman with an expression of profound, clinical pity. Diane slowly reached up with her right hand. She deliberately pulled back the heavy wool lapel of her winter coat. Protruding neatly from the breast pocket of her silk blouse was her smartphone. The screen was brightly illuminated and facing outward. The red digital timer in the exact center of the screen was steadily counting upward. The visual microphone graphic was actively bouncing and recording every single ambient sound in the grocery aisle. The digital recording had been running for over 4 straight minutes. Diane had seen Vanessa storming through the sliding glass doors from across the store and had immediately pressed record before Vanessa even approached her. Vanessa stared completely blankly at the red numbers counting up on the screen. Her arrogant, aggressive posture instantly collapsed. All the color rapidly drained from her face as she realized the catastrophic mistake she had just made. She had just delivered a textbook verbal confession of criminal extortion, blackmail, and intended defamation directly into a high-definition digital microphone. Diane did not raise her voice at all. She spoke with a calm, chilling authority that completely mirrored my own ruthless boardroom demeanor. She told Vanessa that the soft, forgiving mother she used to manipulate had died in the freezing mud at the country club. She coldly informed Vanessa that attempting to extort a major corporate entity and a private citizen for financial gain was a severe felony offense, carrying significant mandatory prison time in our state. Vanessa reached out her hands in a blind, terrified panic, trying to physically grab the smartphone out of Diane's pocket. Diane easily stepped backward, sliding out of reach. She grabbed the heavy handle of her shopping cart and maneuvered it sharply, placing the thick metal basket directly between herself and the desperate younger woman. The physical barrier stopped Vanessa in her tracks. Diane offered a cold, unforgiving smile that did not reach her eyes. She told her former daughter-in-law that she should really learn to keep her mouth entirely shut when she holds absolutely no real leverage. Diane turned her back on the completely stunned woman and walked confidently toward the front of the store, leaving her abandoned shopping cart behind in the aisle. Vanessa tried to follow her, but her legs refused to move forward. She was completely paralyzed by the terrifying legal trap she had just willingly walked right into. She stood frozen next to the dairy coolers, watching Diane walk smoothly out the automatic sliding glass doors and step into the bright morning sunlight. Diane walked to her car and sat down in the driver's seat. She locked the doors immediately. She unlocked her phone screen and pressed the stop button on the active audio recording. She did not hesitate to think about the consequences for a single second. She opened her secure encrypted email application and attached the high-definition audio file. She typed in Sinclair's direct corporate email address. She pressed send without any remorse. The digital file containing undeniable absolute proof of felony extortion flew through the cellular network directly to the most aggressive corporate litigator in the city. Diane started the engine and drove home feeling a deep, immense sense of satisfaction, knowing the final, irreversible nail in Vanessa's coffin had just been hammered in by the very woman she thought was the weakest link. Sinclair received the audio file from Diane and did not waste a single minute. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, listening to the recording with absolute professional detachment. He immediately recognized Vanessa's frantic threats as a textbook violation of state extortion and blackmail laws. Sinclair bypassed all the standard bureaucratic delays by picking up his private phone and calling a senior state judge he had known for over 3 decades. Within 30 minutes, Sinclair was walking into the private emergency chambers of the courthouse holding a secure digital tablet. He played the high-definition audio recording directly for the judge. The judge listened carefully as Vanessa explicitly threatened to fabricate severe physical abuse allegations and completely ruin my corporate reputation strictly for immense financial gain. The evidence was absolute and undeniable. Within an hour, the judge signed a highly restrictive emergency restraining order. This was not a standard stay-away order that allowed for gray areas. Sinclair drafted it to be an absolute legal fortress. It legally barred Vanessa from coming within 1,000 feet of Diane myself, our private suburban residence, my downtown corporate headquarters, and any of our subsidiary office buildings. The document also explicitly prohibited her from contacting any media outlets or journalists regarding our family under the direct penalty of immediate criminal incarceration. The legal strike was surgical, devastating, and completely unannounced. Vanessa returned to the miserable roadside motel feeling entirely triumphant. She genuinely believed her aggressive grocery store ambush had worked flawlessly. She sat on the edge of the stained, sagging mattress, convinced that she had finally outsmarted us. She stared at her phone, fully expecting to receive a desperate call from me begging for a truce and offering to reinstate her luxury penthouse lease. She spent the afternoon imagining the expensive new furniture she would buy with her newly funded trust account. Instead of a phone call, she heard the heavy crunch of gravel outside the thin motel door. Heavy fists began pounding violently against the cheap wood frame. Vanessa smiled arrogantly, assuming I had sent a private corporate courier to deliver the new credit cards. When she opened the door, she did not find a messenger holding a silver platter. She found 2 fully uniformed city police officers standing firmly on the dirty concrete walkway. The officers did not smile, and they did not care about her expensive, wrinkled designer clothes. They asked her to state her full legal name. When she nodded, the lead officer reached out and handed her a thick manila envelope. He informed her in an incredibly loud and stern voice that she had just been officially served with an emergency protective order by the state court. The officer calmly explained the strict legal boundaries of the document. He warned her, looking her dead in the eye, that if she violated a single condition of that order, she would be arrested on site, placed in handcuffs, and held in the county jail without the possibility of bail. Vanessa felt her knees buckle beneath her. She opened the envelope with violently trembling hands and read the judge's signature at the bottom of the page. The absolute terror of facing real prison time finally shattered her arrogant illusion. She realized Diane had not been intimidated by her at all. Diane had simply handed Vanessa the exact rope she needed to legally hang herself. While Vanessa was being legally cornered and terrified in a cheap motel room, Cameron was sitting in his car, attempting to execute his own desperate counterattack. He was parked outside a busy fast food restaurant, stealing their free wireless internet connection. He was completely unaware of his wife's catastrophic extortion attempt and the police presence at their motel. His mind was focused entirely on petty revenge and reclaiming his lost executive status. He honestly believed he was a brilliant technology visionary. He convinced himself over the past 24 hours that the software startup he had ruined was entirely his own creative genius, and that my massive financial backing was just a minor, irrelevant detail. He pulled out his laptop and formulated a highly illegal plan to steal the proprietary source code directly from the company servers. He intended to recruit his entire former development team, take the stolen code, and launch a brand new rival software company to directly compete with my holding company. He arrogantly assumed his developers were deeply loyal to his personal leadership. He actually believed they respected his creative vision more than they cared about their own paychecks and corporate stability. Feeling a sudden surge of false confidence, he picked up his phone and dialed the private number of his lead software engineer, expecting an eager and highly supportive response. The lead engineer answered the phone on the fourth ring, but his tone was completely cold and entirely professional. Cameron ignored the chilly reception and immediately launched into his grand pitch. He spoke quickly and frantically, describing his master plan to bypass the corporate firewalls and transfer the core software architecture onto private external servers hidden offshore. He promised the engineer a massive equity stake and a huge senior executive title in his new imaginary company if he helped facilitate the digital theft tonight. The engineer remained completely silent and let Cameron finish his desperate speech before delivering a crushing dose of unfiltered reality. He calmly informed Cameron that stealing the source code was completely impossible because the entire digital infrastructure had been locked down by elite corporate security teams the exact second Cameron was escorted out of the boardroom yesterday morning. All administrative passwords had been changed, and all remote access protocols had been permanently severed. But the impenetrable security lockdown was not even the worst news Cameron was about to hear. The engineer proceeded to explain exactly what happened at the office after Cameron left the building holding his pathetic cardboard box. He told Cameron that I did not just absorb the company on paper from a distance. I walked directly onto the open concept development floor and held an immediate all-hands meeting with the entire technical staff. I knew my son perfectly well, and I knew he would eventually try to poach the talent I had paid millions to acquire. So I neutralized that specific threat instantly. The engineer told Cameron that I offered every single software developer a permanent secure contract with my primary holding company. I immediately doubled their base salaries across the board and authorized massive performance bonuses for the upcoming quarter. I gave them the absolute financial security Cameron had constantly jeopardized to secretly fund his wife's lavish lifestyle. But that extreme generosity came with one very specific and highly restrictive legal condition. Every single employee, including the lead engineer, had eagerly signed an ironclad non-compete agreement drafted personally by Sinclair. The contract explicitly forbade them from communicating with or working for Cameron in any professional capacity for the next 10 years. The engineer bluntly stated that if anyone helped Cameron steal a single line of code, they would face immediate financial ruin and severe federal criminal prosecution. The engineer did not stop there. He told Cameron that the entire technical team was incredibly relieved to finally have competent adult corporate leadership. He admitted that everyone despised working under Cameron because he was a lazy, arrogant boss who never understood the actual technology. He advised Cameron to never call his personal number again, because any further contact would be reported directly to Sinclair. The line went completely dead. Cameron sat in the driver's seat of his leased car, listening to the silent dial tone. He slowly lowered the phone to his lap, staring blankly through the windshield. The profound gravity of his utter defeat completely crushed the breath out of his lungs. His master plan to build a rival empire was entirely dead before it even started. He had no stolen source code to build a product. He had no development team to write the software. He had absolutely no financial leverage to offer any potential investors. He was just an unemployed man sitting in a fast food parking lot with a severely overdrawn bank account and a wife who had just been legally silenced by a judge. The massive, impenetrable wall I had built around my assets was completely flawless. Cameron finally realized he was entirely outmatched on every single front, and there was absolutely no way to outsmart the relentless system I had engineered to permanently contain him. I would later learn exactly how the final collapse of their toxic marriage unfolded that evening. Vanessa closed the cheap wooden door of the motel room after the city police officers finally drove away. She stood completely frozen, staring at the thick manila envelope in her trembling hands. The crushing reality of the court-ordered restraining order had entirely shattered her arrogant delusion of control. She looked around the miserable room. The stained floral wallpaper, the flickering neon light buzzing right outside the dirty window, and the horrible smell of industrial chemical cleaners suddenly felt like a permanent physical prison. Cameron was sitting on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring blankly at his laptop screen. He was still reeling from the devastating phone call with his former lead software engineer. They were both completely trapped in a tiny, filthy room with absolutely no money and no hope of rescue from any outside source. The suffocating pressure of their total financial ruin instantly evaporated whatever fake honeymoon romance had ever existed between them. Vanessa threw the heavy legal documents onto the stained carpet and completely lost her mind. She turned all of her terrified, frantic rage directly onto her new husband. She started screaming at him at the absolute top of her lungs. She did not care that the strangers in the adjoining rooms could hear every single word through the thin walls. She called him a pathetic, weak excuse for a man. She yelled that he was a complete failure who could not even protect his own software company from his own father. She paced back and forth across the dirty linoleum floor, waving her arms wildly in the air. She explicitly told him that she had only endured his boring personality and his complete lack of ambition because she genuinely believed he was the guaranteed heir to a massive corporate fortune. She screamed that she had sacrificed her own youth and beauty to marry him, fully expecting a lifetime of luxury penthouses and first-class international vacations. Now she was trapped in a roadside slum because he was too stupid to secure his own inheritance. Cameron sat perfectly still on the edge of the cheap bed, letting her vicious insults wash over him like toxic acid. He did not try to defend himself. He did not raise his voice to shout back at her. He did not try to calm her down. He just looked at her face. He looked at the woman he had completely destroyed his relationship with his parents to protect. He remembered the exact moment she had pushed his mother into the freezing mud at the country club. He remembered laughing right along with her because he was so completely blinded by her physical beauty and his own arrogant pride. He had abandoned his own family to stand by a woman who was currently screaming that he was utterly worthless without my money. Then the darkest and most terrifying realization of all finally hit him. He remembered the disastrous meeting in her father's study yesterday afternoon. He remembered her putting on a fake crying performance and pointing her trembling finger directly at him. She had systematically used his failing technology company to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from her own father. She had deliberately tricked him into signing the fraudulent invoices late at night when he was too tired to read the vendor names. She had intentionally set him up to take the absolute fall for a massive federal crime. If the government authorities came knocking on their door, she would gladly watch him be dragged away in handcuffs, just to save herself from going to prison. She did not love him. She had never loved him for a single second. He was nothing more than a disposable financial stepping stone and a convenient legal shield. Something deep inside Cameron finally snapped. It was not a loud, violent explosion of anger. It was a cold, silent implosion of his entire worldview. He stood up from the sagging mattress. He did not speak a single word to her. He simply walked over to the dark corner of the room and grabbed his canvas duffel bag. He unzipped the bag and started throwing his wrinkled clothes inside. Vanessa stopped pacing and watched him with a look of confused disgust. She demanded to know exactly what he thought he was doing. She ordered him to put his bag down and figure out a way to get her out of this disgusting motel before she called the police on him too. Cameron ignored her completely. He grabbed his laptop and shoved it roughly into the bag. He walked into the tiny bathroom and grabbed his toothbrush. He zipped the bag shut and swung the heavy strap over his shoulder. He walked toward the front door, stopping just inches away from where she was standing. He looked down into her angry, desperate eyes. He spoke in a voice she had never heard before. It was completely hollow and entirely devoid of any warmth or emotion. He told her she was entirely right about him being a fool. He admitted he was an absolute idiot for giving up a loving family and a secure future for a parasitic manipulator. He told her that she was completely on her own now. He stated clearly that he would rather sleep on the wet concrete outside than spend another minute breathing the same air as the woman who tried to send him to a federal penitentiary. He turned the brass doorknob and walked out into the freezing rain. Vanessa screamed his name from the doorway, threatening to ruin his life if he left her behind. He did not even turn his head. He just kept walking down the cracked concrete sidewalk, letting the heavy door slam shut behind him, severing their toxic bond forever. The cold rain soaked through his thin jacket within a matter of minutes. He had absolutely no destination in mind. He just walked along the muddy shoulder of the busy industrial highway, keeping his head down, as massive commercial freight trucks roared past him, spraying him with dirty water. He walked for 3 grueling miles in the dark. His expensive imported leather shoes were completely ruined, and his feet were covered in painful bleeding blisters. His muscles ached, and he was shivering violently from the rapidly dropping temperature. Finally, he saw the flickering neon sign of an old roadside diner cutting through the heavy rain. He pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped inside, seeking shelter. The diner was completely empty except for a tired waitress wiping down the counter with a damp rag. Cameron walked slowly over to a booth in the far back corner and slid into the cracked red vinyl seat. He dropped his soaked duffel bag onto the floor beside him. He reached into his wet pocket and pulled out his leather wallet. He opened it and stared at the contents. He had exactly 1 crumpled $10 bill left to his name. The waitress walked over and handed him a laminated menu. He did not even look at the food options. He simply placed the damp $10 bill on the table and asked for a large cup of black coffee. The waitress took the money and quickly brought him a steaming ceramic mug. Cameron wrapped his freezing hands tightly around the warm cup. He turned his head and stared blankly out the rain-streaked window at the dark, empty highway. He sat there in total, absolute silence. The sheer magnitude of his disastrous life choices finally settled heavily onto his shoulders. He had traded a fiercely loyal family, a massive corporate inheritance, and a completely secure future for a beautiful illusion that turned out to be a poisonous, deadly trap. He had absolutely nothing left in the entire world but a cup of cheap, bitter coffee and the crushing, suffocating weight of his own profound regrets. He took a slow sip of the dark drink, realizing this was the exact rock-bottom reality I had engineered for him. He was finally awake, and the nightmare of his real life had just begun. The heavy rain from the previous night had finally stopped by the time the sun began to rise over our quiet suburban neighborhood. I was sitting at the kitchen island, drinking my morning coffee and reading the early financial reports. Outside, the automated sprinklers were quietly watering the pristine, manicured lawns of our estate. The house was completely quiet and perfectly peaceful. Suddenly, the security intercom mounted on the wall buzzed loudly, shattering the morning silence. I walked over and tapped the digital screen to activate the front gate camera. Staring back at me through the high-definition lens was my son. Cameron looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive custom wedding clothes were completely ruined. The fine wool jacket was stained with dark mud and soaked right through to his skin. He was physically trembling, holding his arms tightly across his chest to conserve whatever body heat he had left. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his designer leather shoes were caked in thick highway dirt. He looked directly up at the camera lens and pressed the heavy brass buzzer a second time. He did not say a word into the speaker. He just stood there waiting to be rescued. I pressed the electronic release button and watched the heavy wrought iron gates slowly swing open. Cameron began the long, agonizing walk up our paved driveway. In the past, whenever he had a minor inconvenience or a bad day at school, he would come rushing home expecting absolute comfort. He would expect Diane to greet him at the front door with a warm, dry towel, a hot bowl of soup, and endless words of maternal validation. He walked up the wide stone steps to the front porch, shivering violently with every single step. I did not go to the door. Diane stood up from the kitchen table. She smoothed the front of her thick wool sweater and walked purposefully toward the entryway. She opened the heavy oak door and stepped out onto the covered porch. I stood in the dark hallway just out of sight, watching the interaction unfold. Cameron looked up at his mother with wide, desperate eyes. He took a hesitant step forward, fully expecting her to wrap her loving arms around him and pull him inside out of the freezing cold. Diane did not move a single muscle to welcome him. She stood perfectly still and firmly crossed her arms over her chest, creating an impenetrable physical barrier. She did not offer him a warm towel. She did not ask if he was hungry or thirsty. The bright morning sunlight hit her face, directly revealing the dark, fading purple bruise on her cheekbone. It was the exact spot where her face had hit the jagged stone pathway after Vanessa forcefully pushed her into the freezing mud. That dark bruise was a permanent physical record of Cameron's absolute failure to protect his own mother, and Diane wore it like a badge of absolute authority. Cameron stopped dead in his tracks. The cold, unforgiving rejection in Diane's eyes was something he had never experienced in his entire 28 years of life. He realized the soft, forgiving mother he had constantly taken for granted was completely gone forever. He began to cry. It was not a manipulative, theatrical performance like the ones his wife constantly used to get her way. It was the genuine, pathetic weeping of a completely broken man who had finally hit rock bottom. He stood shivering on the cold stone porch and began rapidly confessing everything. He told Diane about the miserable roadside motel room. He told her how Vanessa had completely drained their personal joint bank accounts to buy secret luxury upgrades. Then his voice cracked completely as he revealed the most terrifying truth of all. He confessed that his new wife had systematically set him up to take the legal fall for massive corporate wire fraud against her own father. He admitted he was absolutely terrified of going to a federal penitentiary for financial crimes he did not even know he was committing. He fell to his knees on the hard stone porch, completely abandoning his false pride. He looked up at Diane and begged for a financial loan. He explicitly stated he did not want $1 million, and he did not want his luxury apartment back. He just desperately needed enough cash to hire a competent, aggressive divorce attorney. He needed to legally sever his ties to Vanessa immediately before the federal government investigators started knocking on his motel door. He promised he would pay back every single penny with interest. He swore he would do whatever it took to earn his way back into our family graces. Diane looked down at him, crying at her feet. She did not shed a single tear in response. She simply turned her head and looked back into the dark hallway where I was standing, waiting for my cue. I stepped out of the shadows and walked through the open doorway, stepping onto the porch. Cameron looked up at me with a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope in his bloodshot eyes. He genuinely believed that his terrifying legal situation would force my hand. He assumed I would immediately hire Sinclair to fix his massive mess, just to protect our prestigious family name from the public scandal of a federal criminal indictment. I stood towering over him and reached my right hand into the inner breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. Cameron held his breath, fully expecting me to pull out my leather checkbook or a fresh black corporate credit card. Instead, I pulled out a single folded piece of standard white printer paper. I reached down and handed it to him. Cameron took the paper with violently trembling hands and slowly unfolded it. He stared blankly at the black ink printed on the page. It was not a legal retainer agreement for a top-tier law firm. It was not a cashier's bank draft. It was a standard blank employment application for a minimum wage warehouse associate position at one of my massive industrial fulfillment centers located on the dirty industrial outskirts of the city. I looked down at my son and delivered his absolute final reality check. I told him that I was absolutely not going to hire Sinclair to save him from his own stupidity. I told him I was not going to write a blank check to a fancy divorce lawyer. I explained that the fulfillment center was currently hiring night shift laborers to load heavy wooden pallets onto commercial freight trucks. The starting pay was exactly $15 an hour, with no benefits for the first 90 days. I told him that if he wanted to hire a lawyer to save himself from prison, he would need to fill out that exact application, pass a standard mandatory drug test, and show up for new hire orientation on Monday morning at 6 o'clock sharp. Cameron stared at the application paper in absolute stunned disbelief. He reminded me that he was a former chief executive officer with an expensive university degree. He begged me to at least give him a mid-level management position in the downtown corporate office so he could afford adequate legal representation much faster. I shook my head slowly, rejecting his plea instantly. I told him that an executive title requires profound trust, rigorous discipline, and absolute, unshakable loyalty. He had clearly proven he possessed absolutely none of those vital qualities. He had blindly signed fraudulent financial documents because he was simply too lazy to do his actual job. He had allowed his arrogant wife to physically assault his mother because he was too weak to stand up for his own blood. I told him in a voice as cold and sharp as a steel blade that the only money he would ever see from me again was the money he earned by physically punching a factory time clock. I told him he would be treated exactly like every other unskilled manual laborer in that massive warehouse. He would get absolutely no special treatment, no advanced corporate promotions, and absolutely no unearned respect from the floor managers. He would sweat and ache and physically exhaust himself every single night just to earn enough cash to survive the week. I told him that was the only path forward for him. He could take the grueling job and finally learn the true value of a hard-earned dollar, or he could walk back down the driveway right now and take his chances with the Federal Bureau of Investigation alone. Cameron looked at the cheap paper application in his hands and then looked back up at the dark, fading bruise on his mother's face. He finally understood that the unlimited bank of his parents was permanently locked and closed. The absolute financial safety net he had relied on his entire life was completely gone forever. He slowly folded the piece of paper in half and slipped it into his wet jacket pocket. He did not try to argue anymore. He did not complain about the harsh conditions. He simply nodded his head silently, pushing himself up off the cold stone floor. He turned around without saying a single word of goodbye and began walking back down the long paved driveway, heading back out into the cold, harsh reality of the world he had created for himself. Diane and I stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch, watching him walk away, knowing we had just given him the absolute only gift that could actually save his ruined life. The brutal, unforgiving gift of absolute accountability. Driven by sheer absolute starvation, Cameron had no choice but to surrender completely to the harsh reality I had laid out for him. He spent the entire weekend sleeping, sitting up in a hard plastic chair at the downtown public bus terminal. He had not eaten a real meal in 3 days. His stomach cramped violently and his mouth was completely dry. The arrogant pride that had defined his entire adult life was finally starved out of him, leaving only the basic primal human instinct to survive. On Monday afternoon, he walked 6 miles out to the dusty industrial zone on the edge of the city. He walked into the harsh fluorescent lighting of the warehouse human resources office and handed over the crumpled paper application I had given him on my front porch. He submitted to the mandatory drug test without a single word of complaint. Because the night shift had such a high turnover rate for manual laborers, he was hired on the spot. He was instructed to report to the main floor at 6 o'clock that evening. Cameron walked into the massive fulfillment center and felt incredibly small. The warehouse was the size of 4 professional football fields combined. The air smelled heavy with diesel exhaust, cardboard dust, and industrial lubricant. The noise was absolutely deafening. Forklifts beeped constantly, and massive conveyor belts roared as they moved thousands of packages overhead. Cameron was directed to the loading dock sector, which was universally known as the most physically punishing area in the entire building. There were no robots or automated sorting machines in this section. It was entirely raw manual labor. His shift manager was a massive, broad-shouldered man named Jackson. Jackson had worked on the concrete floor for 20 years, and he had absolutely no patience for weakness or entitlement. He looked at Cameron standing there in his dirty, ruined dress trousers and scoffed loudly. Jackson did not care about Cameron having my last name. He did not care that Cameron used to wear custom-tailored suits and sit in a glass corner office. To Jackson, my son was just another warm body needed to load heavy wooden pallets onto the back of commercial freight trucks. Jackson handed Cameron a bright yellow high-visibility safety vest, a box cutter, and a pair of cheap rough canvas work gloves. He pointed toward a massive pile of incoming freight and ordered Cameron to start moving boxes immediately. The physical labor was absolutely brutal and completely unforgiving. Cameron was assigned to unload heavy boxes of industrial supplies. Each box weighed between 40 and 60 pounds. He had to bend down, lift the heavy cardboard hoisted onto his shoulder, and carry it across the wooden pallets into the dark trailer of the waiting truck. For the first hour, he tried to maintain a fast pace, hoping to impress the manager. By the second hour, his entire body began to violently rebel. He had never done a single day of hard physical labor in his entire life. His hands were soft from years of typing on expensive laptops and holding crystal champagne glasses. The rough canvas gloves quickly rubbed the skin raw. Massive, painful blisters formed on his palms and fingers, eventually popping and bleeding into the fabric. The pain in his hands was nothing compared to the agony in his lower back and legs. Every single time he bent over to pick up another heavy box, his muscles screamed in protest. The warehouse was not air-conditioned. The heat radiating from the metal roof combined with the exhaust from the idling trucks turned the loading dock into a suffocating oven. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and soaking his shirt. He looked around at the other men working on the dock. They were moving steadily and silently, doing the exact same back-breaking work without a single complaint. They were doing this grueling labor to feed their children and keep a roof over their heads. Cameron suddenly realized with crushing clarity that he used to spend their entire monthly salary on a single casual dinner at a fancy downtown restaurant. The physical labor systematically stripped away every single ounce of his lingering arrogance. He could not hide behind a fancy job title or a leased sports car anymore. He was reduced to the pure physical limit of his own body. The monotonous, repetitive nature of the work left his mind completely alone with his thoughts. The silence in his head was far worse than the deafening noise of the warehouse. He was forced to confront the absolute truth of his own actions. Every time his muscles burned and ached, he remembered the exact moment his mother fell at the country club. He saw Diane hitting the ground. He saw the thick brown mud splashing across her beautiful dress. He saw the bright red blood welling up on her cheek. And worst of all, he heard his own voice. He heard the cruel, mocking laughter he had shared with Vanessa. He realized he had laughed at the pain of the only woman who had ever truly loved him unconditionally. The night dragged on endlessly. He worked through the midnight lunch break because he had absolutely no money to buy food from the vending machines. He just drank cold water from a dirty fountain and went back to lifting boxes. Finally, at 6 o'clock in the morning, a loud, piercing buzzer echoed across the massive facility, signaling the end of the night shift. Cameron dropped his last box and collapsed against the metal wall of the truck trailer. He was completely exhausted, shivering despite the heat, and covered in a thick layer of industrial grime. He slowly dragged his aching body toward the employee locker room. The room was a long, narrow corridor lined with dented gray metal lockers, and it smelled heavily of stale sweat and cheap antibacterial soap. The other workers quickly changed their clothes and hurried out to their cars, eager to go home. Cameron waited until the room was completely empty. He walked over to his assigned locker and opened the squeaky metal door. He reached inside and grabbed his canvas duffel bag. He unzipped the main compartment, searching for a clean, dry shirt to put on before he began the long walk back to the bus station. As he dug his bleeding fingers deep into the bottom of the bag, he felt something stiff hidden inside the inner lining. He pulled it out. It was a folded piece of thick, expensive stationery paper. He did not recognize it at first. He opened the paper slowly. The handwriting was elegant and incredibly familiar. It was a letter from Diane. She had written it to him 5 years ago on the exact day he graduated from his university. He must have shoved it into the side pocket of this old gym bag years ago and completely forgotten about its existence. Cameron leaned against the cold metal lockers and began to read his mother's words. Diane had written about how incredibly proud she was of the man he was becoming. She wrote that she knew he possessed a kind and generous heart. She expressed her deep, unwavering belief that he would go out into the world and do honorable things. She ended the letter by telling him that no matter what happened in his life, she would always be his safe harbor, and she would always love him with every single ounce of her being. The sheer profound contrast between the beautiful, loving words written on that paper and the disgusting, cruel betrayal he had committed absolutely broke him. The last remaining wall of his ego completely shattered into dust. He slid down the front of the cold metal lockers until he was sitting on the dirty concrete floor. He pulled his knees up to his chest and clutched the crumpled letter tightly in his bleeding hands. He began to weep. It was not the panicked crying of a man who had lost his money or his status. It was the deep, agonizing sobbing of a son who finally realized the immense, catastrophic magnitude of his own sins. The crushing weight of his guilt pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He sat alone in the dark industrial locker room, crying bitterly for the loving mother he had discarded, the honorable life he had thrown away, and the unforgivable pain he had caused to the people who mattered most. After Cameron walked out into the freezing rain, Vanessa remained trapped in the dismal motel room entirely alone. By Wednesday morning, the incredibly patient motel manager finally ran out of sympathy. He knocked loudly on the peeling wooden door and demanded the daily cash rate. When Vanessa tried to hand him the deactivated corporate credit card, he recognized it from the previous day and immediately ordered her to pack her bags. He gave her exactly 1 hour to vacate the property before he called the local police to report her for trespassing. She dragged her heavy designer suitcases out to the cracked concrete sidewalk, struggling under the immense weight of her own belongings. To make her situation completely worse, her phone began vibrating with angry text messages from a former country club friend. The friend informed her that Montgomery had officially hired a team of ruthless private investigators to finalize the corporate fraud case against her. Montgomery was actively preparing to hand the entire criminal file over to the federal authorities by the end of the week. She was completely out of time and completely out of options. Vanessa desperately needed a legal shield and a massive influx of cash to secure a new place to live. She abandoned 2 of her heaviest suitcases on the sidewalk because she physically could not carry them. She walked 2 miles down the noisy commercial highway until she found a cheap legal clinic squeezed tightly between a pawn shop and a discount liquor store. The lawyer inside was a desperate man who operated strictly on contingency fees, taking a massive percentage of any settlement he could force. Vanessa sat in his cramped office, which smelled heavily of old coffee and cheap cigar smoke. She completely fabricated a wild, unhinged story for him. She claimed her husband Cameron was secretly a multimillionaire who was hiding vast sums of corporate wealth in offshore accounts. She painted herself as the innocent abandoned wife who was currently starving on the streets because of a cruel, wealthy family. The sleazy lawyer saw an opportunity for a massive, unearned payday. He immediately drafted a highly aggressive lawsuit, demanding emergency spousal support and demanding half of all marital assets to maintain the luxurious lifestyle she had become accustomed to during their extremely brief marriage. The sleazy lawyer hired a cheap process server to track Cameron down and serve the legal papers. The server managed to locate Cameron at the industrial warehouse just as he was clocking in for his grueling night shift. But I had already anticipated Vanessa would try one final desperate legal maneuver. I had explicitly instructed the warehouse security team to immediately flag any legal documents directed at my son and forward them directly to my corporate legal department. Sinclair intercepted the ridiculous lawsuit before the envelope even reached the warehouse floor. Sinclair called me at home and read the absurd demands over the phone. Vanessa was legally demanding $50,000 a month in maintenance fees and exclusive access to the downtown penthouse she still arrogantly believed Cameron secretly owned. I took a sip of my morning coffee and told Sinclair it was finally time to permanently bury her. Sinclair did not just file a standard legal defense. He drafted a catastrophic countersuit on behalf of Cameron. We did not need Cameron to sign a single piece of paper because Sinclair still held active power of attorney over the dissolved technology startup which Vanessa had directly targeted in her greedy lawsuit. Sinclair compiled a devastating arsenal of absolute irrefutable proof. He included the high-definition audio recording Diane had captured in the grocery store, proving Vanessa was actively engaged in criminal extortion and malicious defamation. Then Sinclair made a private phone call directly to Montgomery. Montgomery was absolutely thrilled to assist in his own daughter's total legal destruction. He immediately sent Sinclair the complete forensic audit, detailing exactly how Vanessa had systematically embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from his logistics company. Sinclair attached every single fraudulent invoice and forged signature directly to the countersuit. Less than 48 hours after filing her ridiculous claim, Vanessa was legally forced to attend a mandatory sworn deposition at Sinclair downtown corporate office. She arrived wearing her last clean designer outfit, expecting to completely intimidate my legal team with her usual arrogant attitude. She sat across the massive polished mahogany conference table with her cheap contingency lawyer, looking incredibly smug. She genuinely believed her fabricated story about hidden offshore accounts would force us to offer a massive cash settlement just to make her go away quietly. Sinclair sat calmly at the head of the table, adjusting his expensive reading glasses. A certified court reporter sat quietly in the corner, recording every single word spoken in the room, creating an absolute permanent legal record. Sinclair began the deposition by asking Vanessa a series of very simple, straightforward questions under the strict penalty of perjury. He asked her to confirm for the official record that she had never engaged in any corporate financial misconduct during her marriage. She smiled arrogantly and swore under oath that she was completely innocent of any financial crimes. He then asked her to confirm that she had never attempted to extort my family or threaten my wife for financial gain. She laughed lightly and swore she had never made any such threats, calling the very idea completely ridiculous. Her sleazy lawyer leaned back in his chair, looking extremely confident. He completely believed his client was telling the truth. Vanessa had confidently marched right into a devastating legal minefield, and Sinclair was simply waiting for the perfect moment to press the detonator. Sinclair did not raise his voice or show any emotion. He simply reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a small digital audio player. He placed it carefully on the polished wood table and pressed the play button. The crystal-clear, high-definition audio of Vanessa screaming her vicious extortion threats at Diane in the grocery store echoed loudly through the silent conference room. Every single threat she made about going to the press and faking physical abuse allegations was captured perfectly for the court reporter to hear. Vanessa completely froze in her chair. All the color instantly drained from her face as she realized she had just committed blatant documented perjury on the official legal record. Her lawyer sat up straight, his false confidence completely shattered in a matter of seconds. He immediately tried to halt the deposition, claiming he had not been provided with the audio evidence during the initial discovery phase. Sinclair completely ignored his pathetic objections. Sinclair reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of printed financial documents, sliding them directly across the smooth table. It was the complete forensic audit Montgomery had provided. Sinclair calmly read the exact dates and amounts of the stolen logistics funds, placing the corresponding forged vendor invoices right in front of Vanessa. He pointed out her own digital authorization signatures, proving beyond any reasonable doubt that she had deliberately laundered stolen money through her husband's failing business to buy luxury goods. Sinclair looked directly at her cheap lawyer and coldly explained the absolute reality of the situation. He informed the man that his client was completely broke, heavily in debt, and actively under investigation for massive federal wire fraud by her own wealthy father. Sinclair stated very clearly that any further attempt to pursue the fraudulent spousal support claim would result in the lawyer being personally sanctioned by the State Bar Association for filing malicious and completely baseless litigation. He warned the man that continuing to represent Vanessa would destroy his own legal career. The sleazy lawyer looked at the undeniable mountain of evidence and then looked at Vanessa with absolute pure disgust. He realized he was never going to see a single penny from this disaster. He stood up, packed his briefcase without saying a word, and walked right out of the conference room, completely abandoning his client on the spot. Vanessa sat completely alone at the massive conference table. The court reporter continued typing silently in the corner, recording her absolute total defeat. She had absolutely no legal representation, no money, and nowhere left to hide. Her elaborate web of lies had been completely dismantled piece by piece. Sinclair closed his files neatly and advised her to seek a public defender immediately because the federal authorities would be filing formal criminal charges by the end of the month. She was left entirely defenseless, facing absolute total bankruptcy and the terrifying reality of a very long mandatory prison sentence. The divorce mediation was scheduled for a bleak Thursday morning inside a sterile gray conference room at the downtown courthouse. The entire legal proceeding took exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes to completely dissolve a marriage that had caused so much catastrophic damage. Vanessa arrived completely alone, dragging a single heavy suitcase behind her. Her former arrogance had been entirely eradicated by the sheer terror of her impending criminal charges. She wore a simple dark sweater, and her hair was tied back in a messy knot. The luxurious aura she had spent years cultivating had completely vanished, leaving behind a very frightened and very small woman. She sat on the far side of the long wooden table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Sinclair sat at the head of the table, acting as the commanding force of the mediation. He did not waste any time with pleasantries or gentle negotiations. He opened his thick leather folder and slid a single meticulously drafted settlement agreement across the polished wood surface. He outlined the absolute final terms in a cold, clinical voice. Vanessa was to walk away from the marriage with absolutely zero financial support. There would be no monthly alimony payments, no division of imaginary corporate assets, and no lump sum cash settlement to help her relocate. She was legally surrendering every single claim to Cameron and our family estate. In exchange for her complete and total compliance, Sinclair agreed to permanently bury the audio recording of her grocery store extortion attempt. He promised he would not forward the digital file to the state prosecutor, protecting her from a guaranteed felony conviction and a mandatory prison sentence. Vanessa stared at the white paper resting on the table. She knew she had absolutely no leverage left to negotiate a better deal. Her own father was still actively preparing to hand her over to federal investigators for the logistics embezzlement, and she desperately needed to avoid fighting a war on two separate legal fronts. The state extortion charges would have resulted in her immediate arrest. She slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy black pen Sinclair had provided. She did not cry or try to put on a dramatic performance. She was far too exhausted and terrified for any more theatrical manipulation. She pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name on the dotted line, officially signing away her entire luxurious future. Cameron sat directly across from her during the entire process. He was wearing clean dark jeans and a plain gray shirt. His hands were resting quietly on the table. The rough canvas work gloves from the warehouse had left his palms heavily calloused and covered in healing blisters. He did not look at Vanessa a single time. He did not look at the woman who had ruined his life and almost sent him to federal prison. He stared straight ahead with a blank stoic expression. The grueling manual labor and the crushing reality of his new life had completely hardened him. The weak, entitled boy who used to blindly sign whatever documents were placed in front of him was gone. He carefully read every single line of the divorce decree before picking up his own pen to sign. Once the final signature was placed on the legal document, Sinclair gathered the papers and placed them neatly back into his leather folder. The mediator officially declared the proceedings concluded, and the marriage permanently dissolved. Vanessa stood up from her chair slowly. She grabbed the handle of her heavy suitcase. She looked at Cameron, hoping for a single glance of pity or a final word of goodbye. Cameron simply remained seated, looking down at the empty wooden table. He refused to give her the satisfaction of a final emotional reaction. She turned around and walked out of the conference room, the wheels of her suitcase clicking loudly against the tile floor. Her departure from the courthouse was completely pathetic. She had absolutely no money for a taxi, and her credit cards were all completely deactivated. She walked out the heavy glass doors and stepped onto the busy downtown sidewalk. She had been forced to contact a distant cousin who lived in a rural town 3 states away. The cousin had reluctantly agreed to let her sleep on a living room sofa until she could find a job at a local retail store. Vanessa dragged her heavy bag down the concrete street, heading toward the cheap interstate bus terminal. The woman who once demanded imported floral arrangements and luxury penthouses was now walking miles through the city exhaust to catch a discount bus to a life of complete obscurity. 10 minutes after she left, Cameron finally stood up from the conference table. He thanked Sinclair for his ruthless efficiency and shook the lawyer's hand. He walked down the long, quiet corridor and took the elevator down to the main lobby. He pushed open the heavy courthouse doors and stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. He took a deep breath of the cool city air. He was completely broke. His bank accounts were empty, his credit was destroyed, and he had absolutely no valuable assets to his name. But for the first time in his entire adult life, he was completely free. The toxic, heavy chain that had dragged him down into a world of lies and fraud was finally broken. He was standing on his own 2 feet, entirely responsible for his own survival. I was waiting near the curb right outside the courthouse steps. I was standing next to my dark sedan, leaning casually against the passenger door. I had tracked the mediation schedule, and I knew exactly when he would be walking out. Cameron stopped at the bottom of the concrete steps and looked at me. The physical toll of the warehouse shifts was clearly visible on his body. He looked thinner and much more tired, but there was a new quiet strength in his posture. He did not walk over to me and demand to be let into the warm car. He did not ask for a celebratory dinner or a loan to get a better apartment. He knew the absolute boundaries I had established. We stood there looking at each other across the 20 feet of paved sidewalk. I looked at my son and gave him a single, slow nod. It was a silent acknowledgement between 2 men. I was acknowledging that he had faced the worst consequence of his life and handled the brutal mess himself without begging for a rescue. I was recognizing the hard physical work he was putting in every single night to rebuild his life from absolute zero. It was a nod of genuine respect earned through pure, difficult accountability. Cameron understood the message completely. He did not smile, but the tension in his shoulders relaxed slightly. He returned the nod, looking me directly in the eyes. It was a silent promise that he would keep moving forward on this difficult path. He adjusted the strap of his canvas bag on his shoulder. He turned away from my expensive car and began walking down the crowded sidewalk. He headed directly toward the municipal bus stop located 2 blocks away. He had exactly 3 hours to get across the city and clock in for another grueling 12-hour night shift at the heavy industrial warehouse. I watched him walk until he disappeared into the busy crowd, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace knowing my son was finally going to be completely fine. 6 months have passed since that cold, bleak afternoon outside the downtown courthouse. The bitter, freezing winter rain has finally given way to the warm, gentle breezes of late spring. My life and my business have settled into a highly productive and deeply peaceful rhythm. The technology startup that Cameron nearly drove into complete bankruptcy is now completely unrecognizable. After I absorbed the company and fired the corrupt executive team, I took direct operational control of the daily management. I stripped away the lavish corporate retreats, the expensive catered lunches, and the ridiculous luxury company cars. I implemented strict financial discipline and focused the incredibly talented software engineers on building a functional commercial product instead of chasing empty prestige. Within 4 months, we launched the core software and secured 3 massive corporate contracts. The subsidiary that was bleeding my primary holding company dry is now highly profitable. It stands as a permanent testament to what can be achieved when actual hard work and competence replace arrogance and blind entitlement. But the most profound transformation over these past 6 months did not happen inside a glass boardroom or on a corporate balance sheet. It happened on the dusty concrete floor of the massive industrial fulfillment center. Cameron did not quit after that first agonizing night shift. He went back the next day and the day after that. He survived the brutal 90-day probationary period entirely on his own merit. The heavy physical labor completely changed his body and his mind in ways money never could. He lost the soft roundness of his privileged, wealthy lifestyle and built lean, hard muscle from lifting thousands of wooden pallets. The terrible bleeding blisters on his hands eventually healed into thick, permanent calluses. He learned how to communicate with working-class men and women who did not care about his family name or his expensive university degree. He earned their genuine respect by showing up on time, pulling his own weight, and never complaining about the grueling warehouse conditions. 2 weeks ago, the facility manager, the same massive man named Jackson, who had initially handed Cameron a box cutter, noticed his relentless work ethic and quiet dedication. Jackson promoted Cameron to a mid-level floor supervisor position. Cameron now manages a small team of night shift loaders, ensuring the freight trucks depart on schedule. He earns an honest working-class living, and he uses his own weekly paycheck to rent a very small, modest apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. He buys his own generic brand groceries. He washes his own heavy canvas work uniform, and he carefully budgets his own money to make sure his basic utility bills are paid on time. We do not speak every single day, but the few short conversations we have had recently are grounded in a completely new foundation of mutual respect. He does not ask for cash, and he does not ask for favors. He is finally a fully grown man, standing firmly on his own 2 feet. As for Vanessa, her desperate attempts to manipulate the legal system ended exactly as Sinclair had predicted. Montgomery handed the complete forensic audit over to the federal authorities, and she was formally indicted for massive corporate wire fraud. She is currently residing in a federal minimum security facility completely stripped of her designer clothes, her expensive makeup, and her elite country club memberships. She will spend the next several years wearing a standard-issue prison uniform, paying off a massive financial restitution debt to her own father. Her name is never spoken in our house anymore. She is nothing more than a dark, distant memory representing a harsh, painful lesson that our family survived and ultimately conquered. This evening, the air is incredibly warm and perfectly still. Diane and I are sitting side by side on the back porch of our suburban estate. The sun is slowly setting over the manicured lawns, casting a beautiful, warm, golden light across the stone patio. Resting on the small wooden table between us is a thick stack of finalized legal documents delivered by Sinclair just a few hours ago. These crisp white papers represent the absolute final phase of my silent adjustment. Over the past few months, Sinclair and I completely restructured our entire family estate plan. I have officially transferred the vast bulk of our generational corporate wealth and all of our liquid financial assets into an irrevocable charitable trust. The documents are signed, sealed, and legally bulletproof against any future challenges. The massive fortune I spent my entire adult life building from the ground up is now permanently locked away inside an impenetrable legal fortress. The trust will independently fund pediatric hospitals and educational scholarships for underprivileged children long after Diane and I are gone. Our wealth will never be used to fund another luxury downtown penthouse or a first-class island vacation for greedy, entitled relatives. Our family legacy is completely protected from ever being exploited or weaponized again. The money will simply do good in the world, helping people who actually need it and deserve it. Diane reaches across the small space between us and gently places her warm hand over mine. The dark, ugly bruise on her cheek has been completely gone for months, leaving her face as beautiful and serene as the day I first met her. We sit quietly together, listening to the evening birds singing in the oak trees and watching the sky turn a deep, brilliant shade of purple. We look down at the heavy legal papers and then look out over the peaceful, blooming garden. Diane softly squeezes my hand, drawing my full attention. She tells me in a quiet, steady voice that the hardest thing a loving parent can ever do is to step back and let their child hit absolute rock bottom without rushing in to catch them. She smiles a warm, genuine smile that reaches her bright eyes. We realize in this quiet, fading light that we did not destroy our son. We completely destroyed his toxic, unearned entitlement. We systematically burned away the massive financial safety net that was keeping him immature, weak, and completely blind to the real world. By cutting off his unlimited money and forcing him into the harsh, unforgiving reality of physical manual labor, we actually saved his life. We forced him to find his own personal character, his own inner strength, and his own individual dignity. The brutal, terrifying storm that began with a cruel push in the freezing mud has finally passed completely, leaving behind a clear, bright sky. The massive structural adjustment of our family is officially complete, and the profound, absolute peace we feel tonight is worth every single difficult step of the journey. Did you like my story? And do you agree with the harsh, uncompromising methods I used to teach my son a permanent lesson about real life? Let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. If you believe that true character is built through hard, honest work and absolute personal accountability, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this one. Thank you so much for your continued sweet support, and I am looking forward to reading your thoughts. I will see you in the next life story.